Henry Ford built the largest automobile company on Earth, and then he built a town in the Amazon rainforest. The town had clapboard houses, sidewalks, and fire hydrants. It had a hospital, a power plant, and a rule against drinking. It had square dances on Saturday nights. Ford spent $20 million on it, the equivalent of nearly $400 million today, and in return he received almost no usable rubber, one worker revolt, and a botanical catastrophe that his engineers could neither explain nor prevent. The jungle took the town apart slowly, from the roots upward, and Ford never set foot in it. Not once. The story of Fordlandia begins not in Brazil, but on the assembly lines of Highland Park, Michigan, where Henry Ford first perfected the moving production line in 1913. Before Ford, an automobile required 12.5 hours of skilled labor to assemble. After Ford, it required 93 minutes. The reduction was not merely mechanical. It was, in Ford's mind, moral. Waste was sin. Inefficiency was a species of laziness. The assembly line did not simply build cars faster, it imposed order on the act of building, and order, Ford believed, was the foundation of civilization itself. By the early 1920s, the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, had become the largest integrated industrial facility on Earth. Iron ore entered at one end, finished automobiles rolled out the other. Ford owned the ore mines in Minnesota, the timber forests in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, the rubber plantations he intended to build, the glass factories, the steel furnaces, and the railroad cars that linked them all. He called this vertical integration. His competitors called it obsession. Both descriptions were accurate. But Ford's ambition extended beyond the factory gate. In 1914, he had introduced the $5 day, doubling the prevailing wage for unskilled labor, and the announcement made him the most celebrated industrialist in America. What received less attention was the condition attached to the raise. To earn the full $5, a Ford worker had to submit to inspection by the company's Sociological department, a division staffed by 30 investigators whose job was to visit workers' homes and evaluate their domestic lives. The investigators examined diet, cleanliness, sleeping arrangements, church attendance, drinking habits, and the moral character of boarders. A worker whose wife took in laundry, or whose household was judged disorderly, could be docked pay or dismissed. Ford's own explanation was blunt. "We want to make men in this factory as well as automobiles," he told the Detroit Journal in 1914. The Sociological department was not a footnote to Ford's career, it was a rehearsal. The inspectors kept files. They graded households on a scale of fitness. Workers who spoke little English were enrolled in the Ford English School, where the first sentence they learned was, "I am a good American." Graduates participated in a ceremony in which they walked into a large painted pot labeled Melting Pot, wearing the clothes of their home countries, and emerged on the other side in identical suits, waving small American flags. Ford considered the ceremony inspiring. The workers, many of whom had crossed oceans to reach Detroit, were not consulted on the metaphor. The principle the Sociological department established, that an employer's authority extended into the kitchen, the bedroom, and the habits of the soul, would travel 4,000 miles south and land in the Amazon basin with blueprints and lumber and an unshakable confidence that it belonged there. Ford did not limit this impulse to the Rouge plant. Throughout the 1920s, he built a network of small village industries along the rivers of rural Michigan, placing miniature factories in communities like Northville and Nankin Mills, where workers would divide their time between the assembly of automobile parts and the cultivation of small farms. Ford believed he was rescuing the American yeoman from the corruptions of the city. The workers in these villages lived in Ford-approved housing, grew Ford-approved crops, and danced at Ford-approved square dances, accompanied by an old-time fiddler whom Ford personally employed. The village industries were modest in scale, but they were proof of concept, evidence that Ford's ambition had grown past the production of automobiles and into the production of an entire way of life. Ford's conviction that environment shaped character was not unique to him. It was a common article of progressive-era faith, shared by settlement house reformers, temperance crusaders, and industrial paternalists from George Pullman to Milton Hershey. But Ford carried the idea further than any of his contemporaries because Ford possessed something none of them did: an organization large enough and rich enough to enforce it at scale. The Ford Motor Company in the 1920s generated profits that dwarfed those of most national governments. Ford himself was, by some estimates, the richest man in the world, and he had come to believe, with the certainty of a man who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected, that the system he had built in Michigan could be transplanted anywhere. This was not simply arrogance, though arrogance was present in considerable supply. It was a theology. Ford divided the world into those who produced and those who parasitized. Bankers, speculators, middlemen, and foreign commodity cartels belonged to the second category. Farmers, mechanics, and factory workers belonged to the first, provided they lived correctly, which meant temperately, industriously, and in accordance with Ford's particular vision of Protestant virtue. He did not drink. He did not smoke. He ate sparingly, favoring soybeans, which he also believed could be processed into automobile parts. He expected his workers to follow suit, and when they did not, he regarded their failure as a deficiency of environment rather than a difference of will. Change the environment, and the man would follow. The assembly line was the instrument of this vision. It organized human effort into rational sequences, eliminated wasted motion, and, in Ford's telling, liberated the worker from the tyranny of his own indiscipline. That the worker might not have requested this liberation was a detail Ford did not pause to consider. By 1925, the Ford Motor Company controlled nearly every raw material required to build a Model T, from the sand used in its glass to the wood used in its body panels. Iron, steel, glass, textiles, paint, lumber. Ford had reached backward through the supply chain and seized each link in turn, eliminating the middlemen he despised and replacing their function with Ford employees governed by Ford rules. One material remained beyond his grasp. It arrived by ship from the other side of the world, its price set by men in London whom Ford had never met and whose authority he did not recognize. The material was rubber. The Ford Motor Company consumed more of it than any other manufacturer on Earth. Every Model T required nearly 100 pounds of rubber in its tires, hoses, gaskets, valve stems, and pedal covers. At 2 million vehicles per year, the Ford Motor Company's dependency on imported rubber was not a minor inconvenience. It was a matter of industrial survival. Without rubber, every tire on every automobile Ford manufactured was a hostage to the British Empire. The dependency was intolerable. It violated every principle Ford held about self-sufficiency, about the moral superiority of the producer over the broker, about the American industrialist's right to command his own supply chain from ore deposit to showroom floor. Ford had spent 2 decades eliminating exactly this kind of vulnerability, and here it persisted, embedded in the 4 tires and dozens of smaller components that no automobile could function without. The rubber problem was not merely commercial, it was an affront to the theology of the machine. and Ford intended to solve it the way he had solved every other problem in his career. He would go to the source. He would take possession of the land. He would impose the system. Ford had begun. The rubber tree, Hevea brasiliensis, is native to the Amazon basin. For centuries it grew wild in the lowland forests along the tributaries of the Amazon River, scattered among thousands of other species in the dense tropical canopy. Indigenous peoples of the region had tapped its milky latex for generations, shaping it into balls, waterproof containers, and the soles of crude footwear long before any European understood what they were looking at. The tree was not rare, but it was particular. It thrived only in the humid equatorial lowlands, where rainfall exceeded 80 inches per year, and temperatures never dropped below 65 degrees. It did not grow in rows. It did not grow in plantations. It grew where the jungle permitted it to grow, dispersed among other trees at densities of roughly 7 per acre across millions of acres of forest. The global rubber industry that Henry Ford confronted in the 1920s had been built not on Amazonian extraction, but on Amazonian theft. In 1876, a British adventurer named Henry Wickham had smuggled 70,000 hevea seeds out of Brazil in the hold of a chartered steamship, delivering them to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in London. The British propagated the seeds, shipped seedlings to their colonies in Ceylon and Malaya, and within 3 decades had established rubber plantations that produced more latex than the entire Amazon basin. By 1910, the British and Dutch plantations of Southeast Asia supplied more than 90% of the world's commercial rubber. Brazil, the tree's homeland, had been rendered irrelevant to its own commodity. The British understood something about rubber cultivation that would later prove fatal to Ford's ambitions, though neither Ford nor his advisors ever troubled themselves to learn it. In Southeast Asia, Hevea brasiliensis grew in orderly plantation rows because Southeast Asia lacked the tree's natural enemy. The fungus Microcyclus ule, commonly known as South American leaf blight, existed only in the Amazon basin, where it had co-evolved with the rubber tree over millions of years. In the wild, the tree's wide dispersal through the forest canopy prevented the blight from spreading efficiently. A diseased tree might infect its nearest neighbor, but the nearest neighbor was often hundreds of feet away, separated by dozens of unrelated species. The fungus could not jump that distance. The jungle's own disorder was the tree's defense. Plant the same trees in dense, uniform rows as any plantation required, and the dynamic reversed entirely. Leaf blight could travel from crown to crown without obstruction, stripping the canopy bare and killing young trees within a single wet season. The British had solved this problem by removing the tree from the problem. Ford intended to bring the plantation to the problem's front door. He did not know this yet. He would not have cared if he had. What Ford knew and what enraged him was the price. In 1922, the British Colonial Office had enacted the Stevenson Restriction Act, a scheme designed to prop up rubber prices by limiting the volume of latex that Malayan and Ceylonese plantations could export. Winston Churchill, then serving as colonial secretary, had supported the plan as a matter of imperial fiscal policy. The Stevenson Act was, in essence, a cartel enforced by the British government, and it operated with a candor that Ford found galling. Plantation owners who exceeded their export quotas faced punitive duties. The supply was throttled deliberately, and the price rose accordingly. Rubber that had traded at 15 cents per pound before the Stevenson Act climbed past $1 within 2 years. The Ford Motor Company's annual rubber bill, already substantial, approached $40 million. Harvey Firestone, the tire manufacturer and one of Ford's closest friends, was paying similar sums and making similar complaints. Firestone testified before Congress, denouncing the British scheme as economic warfare against American industry. Ford said less publicly, but felt more intensely. "I am going to get rubber independent of the trust," Ford told an associate in Dearborn, using the word he reserved for any arrangement that placed profits in the hands of men who did not build things. The two men agreed that American industry could not remain dependent on a commodity controlled by a foreign government whose explicit policy was to extract the highest possible price from American manufacturers. Ford's response was characteristic. He did not negotiate. He did not lobby Congress for tariff relief or seek alternative suppliers in Liberia, as Firestone eventually did. He did not invest in the nascent research into synthetic rubber, which German chemists had been pursuing since before the Great War. Ford decided to grow his own rubber. He would find suitable land in the Amazon, clear it, plant it with hevea trees in disciplined rows, and within a decade, produce enough latex to supply every Ford factory on Earth. The project would eliminate the British stranglehold, vindicate Ford's philosophy of vertical integration, and, as a secondary benefit, bring American civilization to a corner of the world Ford regarded as uncivilized. It was, in his view, a problem of management. The resistance of the natural world to industrial logic was not a concept Ford acknowledged. The jungle was simply a factory that had not yet been organized. Ford dispatched agents to Brazil in 1926. The men he sent were not botanists, agronomists, or tropical ecologists. They were company men, loyal Ford employees whose expertise lay in manufacturing logistics and real estate acquisition. Their instructions were to locate a large tract of land suitable for rubber cultivation along a navigable river that could accommodate ocean-going cargo ships. The botanical question, whether the land could actually grow rubber at plantation scale, was treated as secondary. Ford assumed it could. The tree came from the Amazon. Therefore, the Amazon would grow the tree. The logic was circular, and Ford did not notice. The agents made contact with two intermediaries, Jorge Villares and Oswaldo Greite, Brazilian businessmen who understood that the Ford Motor Company's interest in Amazonian land represented an opportunity of extraordinary dimensions. Villares and Greite identified a tract along the Tapajós River, a major tributary of the Amazon in the state of Pará, approximately 600 miles upriver from the port city of Belém. The Tapajós was navigable by ocean-going vessels for much of its lower course, which satisfied Ford's logistical requirement. The surrounding terrain was dense tropical forest, hot, wet, and almost entirely undeveloped by the standards Ford's men understood development to mean. The tract encompassed roughly 2.5 million acres, an area larger than the state of Connecticut, and it could be acquired from the Brazilian government for a price that was, by Ford's standards, trivial. The government of Pará, controlled by local oligarchs eager for foreign capital, granted the concession with minimal conditions and considerable enthusiasm. Ford's company would pay no export taxes on rubber for 50 years. In return, Ford agreed to build infrastructure, schools, and a hospital, and to cultivate the land. The Brazilian press greeted the announcement with optimism. Henry Ford, the man who had democratized the automobile, was coming to develop the Amazon. The name alone was worth more than the concession fee. The concession was signed in 1927. Ford's representatives celebrated the deal as a masterstroke. 2.5 million acres for almost nothing on a navigable river in the homeland of the rubber tree itself. What they did not do was commission a soil survey. They did not test the elevation, the drainage, or the composition of the clay. They did not consult a single tropical botanist. They did not investigate the history of South American leaf blight or inquire why no one, in the entire history of Brazilian rubber extraction, had ever successfully operated a large-scale Hevea plantation in the Amazon basin. The answer was available to anyone who asked. The British had asked 50 years earlier, and it was the reason they had moved the trees to the other side of the world. Ford's men did not ask because Ford had not instructed them to ask, and Ford had not instructed them to ask because he did not believe the question was relevant. Ford's representatives also did not spend meaningful time among the people who already lived along the Tapajós. The river communities were populated by caboclos, people of mixed indigenous and Portuguese descent who had lived in the region for generations, tapping wild rubber, fishing and farming small plots of manioc and beans in clearings along the riverbank. These communities had their own rhythms, their own social structures, their own relationship with the forest and the river that defined every aspect of their existence. They drank cachaca, they ate rice and beans, and farmed according to the seasons of the river, not the clock. They rested during the worst heat of the afternoon and worked in the cooler hours of morning and evening. They would become Ford's workforce, and Ford's managers would attempt to reshape them in the image of Dearborn, Michigan. The managers had blueprints and the full weight of the Ford Motor Company behind them. The caboclos had the jungle. It was not an even contest, though the managers did not yet understand which side held the advantage. The first shipment of materials left Dearborn in the summer of 1928, bound for the Tapajós. It carried prefabricated housing, a sawmill, a power generator, water pumps, hospital equipment, and an American flag. The cargo also included detailed plans for a town, drawn up by Ford engineers who had never seen the Amazon, based on the grid layout of a Midwestern company town. The town would have streets, sidewalks, a water tower, a central square, and a name. Ford called it Fordlandia. The blueprints were precise. The confidence was total. The knowledge was almost none. The first Americans to reach the concession arrived at the Tapajós River in the wet season of 1928, and what they found was not a construction site. It was a wall of forest. The jungle rose from the riverbank in an unbroken mass of green, mahogany, and Brazil nut trees and strangler figs tangled together beneath a canopy so dense that the ground below received almost no direct sunlight. The air was saturated. The temperature hovered near 100 degrees. Mosquitoes descended in clouds. The men had been sent from Michigan with orders to build a town, and they carried with them the blueprints of a place that might have been lifted from the main street of any small city in Indiana or Ohio. The clearing began immediately. Ford's managers hired caboclo laborers from the river settlements and set them to felling trees and burning undergrowth across the site where the town would stand. The work was punishing. Hardwood trunks 2 and 3 feet in diameter had to be cut by hand, their root systems so vast and interlocked that a single tree could take a crew half a day to bring down. Fer-de-lances and bushmasters coiled in the leaf litter, and the men who cleared the first acres worked without the hospital Ford had promised, because the hospital could not be built until the land was cleared, and the land could not be cleared without the men who were dying of snakebite and malaria in the process of clearing it. Termites consumed lumber as fast as the sawmill could cut it. The daily rains turned the cleared ground to a red mud that swallowed boots and machinery with equal indifference. The circular logic of the enterprise announced itself from the first week. Into this landscape, Ford's engineers imposed the grid. The houses came first. They were clapboard structures, painted white, with peaked metal roofs and screened porches, arranged along streets that intersected at right angles and were paved with sidewalks poured in concrete. Fire hydrants were installed at regular intervals. The nearest fire department was 600 miles downriver in Belem. The hydrants connected to a water system pumped from the Tapajós and stored in a steel water tower that rose above the canopy, visible for miles along the river, an American vertical fixed in the horizontal green of the jungle. The tower became the emblem of Fordlandia, a declaration that this place had been claimed and would be governed according to principles that did not originate here. A hospital followed, built to Dearborn standards, equipped with an operating theater, a dental clinic, and wards for several dozen patients. In its early years, it provided medical care of a quality that no one in the Tapajós region had previously had access to, and this was not a small thing. A power plant generated electricity. A sawmill processed the timber cleared from the surrounding forest. A dock extended into the Tapajós to receive the cargo ships that would carry rubber downstream to Belem and onward to Detroit. The physical infrastructure of Fordlandia represented an engineering achievement of genuine difficulty, erected under conditions that would have defeated a less determined and less wealthy organization. But the infrastructure was not the point. The point was the social order that Ford layered on top of it, and that order was where Fordlandia crossed from ambition into something closer to coercion. Ford's managers built a cafeteria at the center of town, a large building where workers were required to take their meals on a schedule calibrated to the rhythms of a Michigan factory, not the rhythms of the equatorial day. The workers filed in carrying metal trays, stood in lines, and received food they had not chosen. The menu was American: hamburgers, whole wheat bread, canned peaches, oatmeal, and canned vegetables shipped from Michigan replaced the rice, beans, manioc flour, and fresh river fish that the caboclo workers had eaten their entire lives. Ford's dietary convictions were not casual. He had written extensively about the relationship between food, health, and industrial output, and his managers enforced those convictions in the Amazon with the same rigor they would have applied in Dearborn. One company report noted with satisfaction that the workers were being educated in the selection of a proper diet suited to their labor, a formulation that did not consider the possibility that people who had fed themselves in this climate for several hundred years might already possess such knowledge. The mandated diet induced nausea. Canned peaches in equatorial heat tasted of tin. The workers found oatmeal inedible. Ford's managers recorded these reactions as evidence of the workers' backwardness, not as a failure of the menu. The town observed Prohibition. Alcohol was forbidden within the boundaries of the concession, enforced by Ford's managers, with a conviction that owed nothing to Brazilian law, which imposed no such restriction. The United States had only recently repealed its own prohibition, and even during the years when the 18th Amendment was in force, its application in the Amazon basin by a private company on foreign soil represented a reach of corporate authority that had no legal precedent and no local support. Cachaca, a sugarcane liquor, was embedded in the social fabric of the Tapajós communities. It was shared at celebrations, offered to guests, consumed in the evening as the heat broke and the river turned dark. Its prohibition at Fordlandia was experienced by the workers not as a health measure, but as an erasure, the cancellation of a custom so fundamental that its absence made the town feel less like a home and more like an institution. A shadow economy in bootleg cachaca appeared almost immediately, operated from boats and shacks just beyond the concession boundary, in settlements the workers named the Island of Innocence. The name itself was an act of irony that Ford's managers, had they been capable of hearing it, might have found instructive. The innocence was not in the drinking, it was in the freedom to make one's own choices about what to drink and when and with whom. a freedom the workers considered ordinary and Ford's company considered a threat to productivity. Ford's managers imposed time clocks. Workers were issued identification badges stamped with numbers, just as they would have been at the Rouge plant in Dearborn, and were required to begin their shifts in the early morning and work through the hottest hours of the equatorial afternoon. Inside the metal-roofed work sheds, where the rubber seedlings were sorted and the plantation tools were maintained, the temperature at midday exceeded what the human body can sustain for extended labor without risk of collapse. Heat prostration was common. Workers fell in the rubber nurseries and on the clearing crews, and the hospital Ford had built to demonstrate American medical superiority found itself treating conditions that the workers' own labor practices, had those practices been permitted, would have prevented entirely. The caboclos had organized their labor around the heat for generations, working in the cooler hours before dawn and after the afternoon broke, resting through the midday in hammocks slung in the shade of mango trees along the riverbank. Ford's time clocks overrode this knowledge with the blunt authority of an industrial schedule designed for a latitude 40 degrees farther from the equator. Saturday evenings brought the square dances. Ford had championed old-time dancing in the United States as a wholesome alternative to jazz, which he associated with moral decay and, in the pages of the Dearborn Independent, with a Jewish conspiracy to degrade American culture. At Fordlandia, square dances were mandatory social events held in an open-air pavilion supervised by American staff, performed by Brazilian workers who had no history with the form and no enthusiasm for its steps. The fiddle music drifted out across the Tapajós on Saturday nights, a sound so foreign to its setting that it might have been a transmission from another century arriving in the wrong hemisphere. The town also replicated the class geography of an American company settlement. American managers occupied larger houses on the hill above the main town, where the elevation caught a breeze from the river, and the screened porches were wide enough to sit on in the evening with a view of the Tapajós below. Brazilian foremen lived in a middle tier. The laborers lived at the bottom, in the smallest houses, nearest the sawmill and the cleared ground, where the heat collected and the mosquitoes bred in the standing water left by each afternoon's rain. Ford himself never visited. He governed Fordlandia entirely by memorandum, relayed through a succession of managers who rotated in and out of the concession, some lasting only months before the isolation and the futility drove them to request transfers. The distance between Ford's desk in Dearborn and the cafeteria on the Tapajós was not merely geographical. It was a distance of comprehension. Ford's instructions arrived in the jungle, stripped of the context that might have tempered them, and the jungle's answers never reached Ford in any form he was willing to receive. His managers told him what he wished to hear. The workers endured what they could not change. But endurance, even in a place that prizes patience, has limits. By the last weeks of 1930, the cafeteria trays, the time clocks, the prohibition, the metal roofs trapping the equatorial heat into the small hours of the night, all of it had been accumulating into a pressure that Ford's managers, from their screened bungalows on the hill, had not thought to measure. The workers had. On the 20th of December, 1930, the cafeteria at Fordlandia served its midday meal as usual. The workers filed in with their metal trays. They received their portions of food they had not chosen and did not want, and then, without coordination or warning, they began to destroy the room. The revolt started with the dishes. Workers swept plates and cups from the tables, sending them shattering across the concrete floor. The tables followed, overturned with a noise that carried across the settlement. Men seized chairs and swung them through the windows of the serving line. The kitchen was ransacked. The meal schedule, the centerpiece of Ford's dietary regime, was dismantled in a matter of minutes. The workers poured out of the cafeteria and into the streets of Fordlandia, smashing the time clocks that had regulated their days, overturning company trucks, and advancing on the houses where the American managers lived on the hill above the town. Several managers fled to the dock on the Tapajós with their families. Others locked themselves inside their bungalows and waited. The Brazilian foreman, Manuel Caetano, attempted to calm the workers and was ignored. For the better part of a day, the laborers of Fordlandia held the town they had built with their own hands and had never been permitted to govern. Some accounts call the revolt the breaking of the pots. Others use the Portuguese, the quebra panelas. Neither name captures the event precisely. It was not a labor action in any conventional sense. There were no demands, no elected representatives, no list of grievances submitted to management. There was no plan for what came after. It was an eruption, the kind of collective refusal that occurs when an imposed order has been endured past the point of tolerance, and the people enduring it discover in the same moment that they have all reached the same conclusion. One Ford manager described the scene in a letter sent afterward to the company offices in Dearborn. He wrote, "The men went at everything at once, as if a signal had been given that none of us heard, and later, by the time we reached the river, the lower town was theirs." The cafeteria was the focal point, because the cafeteria was where the imposition was most intimate, where grown men stood in line with trays and ate what a foreign company told them to eat in a building designed to resemble a factory canteen in a country that was not their own. The Brazilian military arrived by gunboat several days later, summoned by Ford's representatives in Balaam. A small detachment of soldiers disembarked at the Fordlandia dock and moved through the settlement without encountering resistance. The revolt had already spent itself. It had been an act of refusal, not of revolution, and having made their refusal visible, most of the workers simply returned to the river communities from which they had come, carrying their wages and their contempt for the clapboard houses and the Saturday night fiddle music. A handful were arrested. None were charged with serious crimes. Ford's managers, shaken but uninjured, rebuilt the cafeteria, replaced the time clocks, and resumed operations. Some concessions were made. Rice and beans returned to the cafeteria menu alongside the hamburgers and oatmeal. The enforcement of square dances relaxed. The prohibition on alcohol remained, though its observance had become theatrical, the bootleggers of the Island of Innocence operating openly and with a regularity that everyone acknowledged and no one disrupted. Ford's response from Dearborn was characteristic. He did not reconsider the project. He did not examine whether the social architecture of the town might be the source of its problems, rather than the solution. He replaced the managers who had presided over the revolt and sent new ones, with new instructions, and the new instructions differed from the old instructions primarily in their tone, which was firmer. Ford had not built the largest industrial enterprise in the world by retreating from resistance. He regarded the revolt as a failure of local supervision, not as a flaw in the system he had designed. The system could not be flawed. It had worked at Highland Park. It had worked at the Rouge. It had worked in the village industries of rural Michigan. If it was not working on the Tapajós River, the fault lay with the men implementing it or the workers refusing it, but never with the design itself. This conviction would have been sufficient to doom the enterprise on its own, but the revolt, dramatic and humiliating as it was, proved to be the lesser catastrophe. The greater one had been underway in the rubber groves for months, and it was being conducted not by men with grievances, but by an organism with none. The rubber trees at Fordlandia had been planted in rows. Neat, uniform, evenly spaced rows, the botanical equivalent of an assembly line, with young trees set at densities far higher than those at which Hevea brasiliensis grew in the surrounding forest. The logic was Ford's logic, the same logic that governed every productive process at the Rouge. Concentration increased output. Proximity reduced waste. Standardization enabled scale. In the Amazon basin, this logic was a death sentence. South American leaf blight arrived in the Fordlandia plantations with the inevitability of weather. The fungus Microcyclus ulae attacked the leaves of the rubber trees, causing them to curl, wither, and drop. The disease began at the edges of the plantation, where the groves met the surrounding forest, and moved inward with each wet season's rains, carried on wind and water from tree to tree across the unbroken canopy of the plantation rows. In the wild forest, where rubber trees grew at intervals of 100 feet or more from their nearest relative, the blight moved slowly and caused limited damage. In Ford's plantation rows, where the crowns of adjacent trees nearly touched, the fungus traveled from canopy to canopy with the efficiency of fire moving through dry grass. Young trees, their root systems shallow and their immune defenses undeveloped, died within a single wet season. Older trees were stripped of foliage repeatedly, weakened across successive years until they could no longer produce latex in any usable quantity. The plantation that Ford had built to free himself from dependence on British rubber could not keep its own trees alive. Ford's agronomists tried everything their training permitted them to try. They pruned diseased branches. They applied copper sulfate and Bordeaux mixture, chemical treatments that controlled fungal infections in the orchards of temperate North America, but dissolved into irrelevance in the saturating humidity of the equatorial lowlands. They imported seeds from supposedly resistant varieties gathered along distant tributaries, and the new trees proved no more durable than the originals. They cleared fresh land and planted new groves, and the blight followed them into each new clearing within months. The problem was not one of technique. It was structural, embedded in the premise of the enterprise itself. The assembly line model of production, in which identical units are arranged in uniform proximity for maximum output, was precisely the arrangement that Microcyclus ulei had evolved over millions of years to exploit. Ford's agronomists were attempting to outmaneuver a pathogen whose head start was measured in geological time. The insects followed the blight. Lace bugs and red spiders descended on the young plantings, stripping leaves the fungus had not yet reached. Sauba ants, the leafcutter ants of the Amazon, dismantled entire sections of the nursery overnight, carrying fragments of rubber foliage underground to their fungal gardens in columns so disciplined and so efficient that the parallel to Ford's own assembly lines was difficult to avoid. The Michigan-trained agronomists who supervised the rubber program had been educated in the agricultural colleges of the American Midwest, where the growing season was predictable, the pests were catalogued, and the relationship between effort and yield could be calculated in advance. They did not understand the Amazon. The Amazon, which had been refining its own systems for longer than human agriculture had existed, did not require their understanding in order to continue operating. The irony was structural and complete. Henry Ford had built his empire on the principle that uniformity and proximity produced efficiency. In the jungle, uniformity and proximity produced catastrophe. The same organizational logic that made the Model T the most efficiently produced automobile in the history of manufacturing made Fordlandia's rubber trees the most efficiently destroyed plantation crop in South America. Ford's theology of the machine had encountered the theology of the forest, and the forest's theology was older, and it did not negotiate. By 1934, the Fordlandia plantation had produced almost no rubber fit for export. Thousands of trees had been planted across hundreds of cleared acres, and most were dead or dying. The town still stood. The water tower still rose above the canopy. The hospital still treated malaria and snakebite and the heat prostration that the time clocks continued to produce. But the rubber groves, the entire justification for the town's existence, were a failure so thorough that even Ford's most optimistic managers could no longer describe the situation as temporary. Ford did not accept this conclusion. He ordered new land cleared 30 miles downriver, on a plateau with flatter terrain and better drainage and soil that his latest agronomists judged more suitable for cultivation, and instructed his managers to begin again. He called the new site Belterra. The jungle had delivered its answer. Ford had not recognized the language. Belterra occupied a plateau 30 miles downriver from Fordlandia, on ground that was flatter, drier, and exposed to steadier wind than the original concession site. Ford's agronomists believed the elevation and the air circulation would slow the spread of leaf blight. They were partially correct. The rubber trees planted at Belterra survived longer than those at Fordlandia. They grew taller, produced thicker trunks, and in their early seasons showed fewer signs of Microcyclus oolei infection. The Ford Company planted thousands of grafted trees at the new site, using bud grafting techniques borrowed from the British plantations of Malaya, joining blight-resistant rootstock to high-yielding crown varieties in an effort to engineer a tree that could withstand the fungal pressure of the Amazon basin. For several seasons, the grafted trees appeared to justify the investment. Ford's managers sent cautiously optimistic reports to Dearborn. The reports did not mention what the managers could see with their own eyes, which was that even the grafted trees were beginning to show the telltale curling of leaves at the edges of their canopies. The blight had not been defeated at Belterra. It had been delayed. By the late 1930s, Microcyclus oolei was moving through the Belterra groves with the same patient efficiency it had demonstrated at Fordlandia, and the grafted crowns, selected for latex yield rather than fungal resistance, proved no more durable than the ungrafted originals once the density of infection in the surrounding plantation reached a critical mass. Trees that had required 5 years to reach tapping age were defoliated in a single wet season. The cycle that had destroyed the Fordlandia plantation was repeating itself at Belterra in slower motion, but with identical results. The blight was not an antagonist with a strategy. It was an environmental constant, as indifferent to Ford's second attempt as it had been to his first. Ford's managers at Belterra did make concessions that their predecessors at Fordlandia had refused. The cafeteria served Brazilian food alongside the American menu. Workers were permitted to cultivate small garden plots where they grew manioc and beans for their own consumption. The rigid enforcement of Michigan factory hours softened, though the time clocks remained bolted to the walls and the principle behind them was not renounced. The square dances continued, attended with diminishing enthusiasm by the Americans who organized them, and the shrinking number of Brazilian workers who had learned the steps and found them, if not pleasurable, at least no longer worth resisting. The social architecture of Fordlandia had been sanded down at Belterra. Its edges were softer. Its fundamental premise was unchanged. Ford's representatives still governed the concession as an American outpost on foreign soil, issuing directives from Dearborn, enforcing company rules that had no basis in Brazilian law, and regarding the local population as a workforce to be shaped rather than a community to be consulted. "We are not here to adapt to them," one American manager at Belterra wrote to a colleague in 1939. "We are here to show them how it is done." The letter was written in the same year that the plantation had still not produced enough rubber to supply a single Ford factory for a single day. The world beyond the Tapajós was moving in a direction that would make both Fordlandia and Belterra irrelevant before either site ever justified its cost. In September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The war that followed disrupted the global rubber supply with a severity that made the Stevenson Act look modest. Japan's conquest of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies in 1942 cut the United States off from more than 90% of its natural rubber supply in a matter of weeks. The crisis was immediate and existential. The American military consumed rubber in vast quantities for tires, gaskets, fuel bladders, the treads of landing craft, and the seals on every piece of machinery that moved or contained pressure. The possibility of running out entirely was not theoretical. The solution was not Henry Ford's Amazon plantation. The solution was chemistry. The United States government assembled a crash program to develop synthetic rubber, pooling the research of Standard Oil, Goodyear, Firestone, and a consortium of smaller firms under a federal directive that suspended patent disputes and overrode competitive rivalries. The program was headquartered not in the tropics, but in the same industrial corridor Ford had spent his career dominating, the factories and laboratories of the American Midwest. By 1944, American plants were producing more than 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber per year, a volume exceeding the combined output of every natural rubber plantation on Earth. The material was manufactured from petroleum and alcohol, commodities the United States possessed in abundance, requiring no foreign concessions, no tropical plantations, no cafeterias serving oatmeal in equatorial heat, and no Saturday night square dances. The rubber crisis that Henry Ford had spent 2 decades and $20 million attempting to solve through agriculture was solved through industrial chemistry in less than 3 years. The synthetic rubber program did not mention Fordlandia. It did not need to. Ford's Amazon plantations had never produced rubber in quantities that registered on any national supply calculation. The entire output of both Fordlandia and Belterra, across nearly 2 decades of continuous operation, would not have supplied the American war effort for a single week. The scale of Ford's failure was not spectacular. It was quiet, measured in the distance between what the plantation was meant to produce and what it actually delivered, a distance so vast that by the final years of the war, the subject had ceased to be discussed, even within the offices of the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford was 82 years old in 1945, diminished by a series of strokes that had left him confused and erratic. His grip on the company broken by the maneuvering of his grandson, Henry Ford II, who was working to wrest control from Harry Bennett, the security chief who had governed the company's labor relations through intimidation for 2 decades. The elder Ford had outlived his relevance to his own enterprise. The enterprise had outlived its patience with his jungle project. When the younger Ford assumed the presidency of the company in September of 1945, the disposal of the Amazon concessions was among his earliest acts of housekeeping. Henry Ford II sold both plantations back to the Brazilian government for $244,200. The Ford Motor Company had invested an estimated $20 million in the Fordlandia and Belterra concessions across 18 years. The sale price represented a return of approximately 1 cent on every dollar spent. The transaction was handled without ceremony, recorded as the closure of an overseas asset. The elder Ford, confined to his estate at Fair Lane in Dearborn, did not attend the closing. He died in April of 1947 in the same house in which he had been born during a spring flood that knocked out the local power station and left the room lit by candles and kerosene lamps of the kind his assembly line had been built to make obsolete. The rubber trees at Belterra continued to grow after the Ford Company departed. The Brazilian government maintained a small research station on the site for several years, studying tropical agronomy and the genetics of blight resistance. The town did not vanish. It became a Brazilian town, its houses repainted in colors Ford would not have chosen, its streets inhabited by families who had no connection to the Ford Motor Company and no particular memory of the square dances. The water tower stood. The jungle pressed against the clearing. A man who had mastered the production of the automobile from raw ore to finished vehicle had been unable to grow a tree. The town of Fordlandia still exists. It stands along the eastern bank of the Tapajós River in the state of Pará, a settlement of several thousand people who live among and around the remains of Henry Ford's jungle enterprise. The clapboard houses are still there, some of them, repainted in the bright blues and yellows and greens that Brazilians favor for tropical dwellings, colors Ford would have found disorderly. The hospital still stands, its corridors empty, its operating theater stripped of equipment, its tiled floors stained by decades of rainwater seeping through a roof. No one has repaired. The steel water tower rises above the settlement as it has for nearly a century, rusted the color of the laterite soil beneath it, visible from the river as the first and last landmark of a project that was meant to reshape the Amazon, and became instead a monument to the Amazon's indifference to being reshaped. The jungle has reclaimed what was not maintained. Vines wrap the posts of porches where American managers once sat in the evenings, watching the Tapajós turn copper in the failing light. The sawmill is a shell. The power plant is silent. The concrete sidewalks Ford's engineers poured in the 1920s are cracked and heaved by the roots of trees that have been recovering the ground since the company departed. The fire hydrants, those emblems of Midwestern municipal confidence, still protrude from the earth at intervals along the overgrown streets, connected to nothing, serving no purpose, standing as punctuation marks in a sentence the jungle finished writing decades ago. A journalist who reached Fordlandia by boat in the 1980s described the scene as an American ghost town that wandered into the wrong continent and could not find its way home. The Brazilian families who live in Fordlandia today are not Ford employees. They are river people, caboclos and their descendants, who settled in the town after the company left because the houses were standing. The river was convenient for fishing, and the cleared land along the bank was suitable for small-scale farming. They know the name Ford. They know that Americans built the town and departed. The specific details of the enterprise, the leaf blight, the sociological department, the theology of the assembly line, have faded into the sediment of local memory, replaced by the practical concerns of living in a small Amazonian community with limited electricity, intermittent government services, and a river whose seasonal rhythms define the shape of daily life in ways that Henry Ford never understood and never attempted to learn. Fordlandia was not the only American town built on the conviction that sufficient capital and will could redesign a landscape and the people inhabiting it. The pattern runs deep, and it did not originate with Ford. George Pullman constructed his model city outside Chicago in the 1880s, a company town designed to house the workers of his Palace Car Company in conditions Pullman believed would produce sobriety, order, and industrial loyalty. The town had a library, a church designed by a prominent architect, and a prohibition on independent saloons. It also had rents that Pullman controlled, wages that Pullman set, and a political structure that answered to Pullman rather than to the residents. When the Panic of 1893 forced Pullman to cut wages without reducing rents, the workers struck, and the strike became one of the most violent labor confrontations of the Gilded Age, requiring the intervention of federal troops and producing a Supreme Court case that reshaped American labor law. The town of Pullman was eventually annexed by the city of Chicago, its experiment in corporate order absorbed into the democratic disorder of a city that did not answer to a single employer. The coal company towns of Appalachia enacted the same logic in harsher terrain. In the hollows of West Virginia, Kentucky, and southwestern Virginia, coal operators constructed settlements where miners lived in company houses, purchased their food at the company store on credit, deducted from their wages, and were paid in scrip, redeemable only within the company's own economy. The operators controlled the schools, the churches, the law enforcement, and in many counties, the electoral machinery itself. The miners' lives were circumscribed from shaft to supper table. When miners organized, the operators responded with evictions, private guards armed with rifles, and at Blair Mountain in Logan County, West Virginia, in 1921, machine guns and aerial bombardment, the only instance in American history in which the federal government authorized the bombing of its own citizens on domestic soil. The company towns endured as long as the coal endured. When the seams thinned or the markets turned, the operators departed and left behind communities with no independent industry, no diversified economy, and no institutional memory of self-governance, a legacy of extraction and dependency that persists in the region to the present day. Ford knew the history of Pullman. He had lived through the era of the coal company towns and their collapses. He drew no instruction from either because Ford believed that his predecessors had failed not in principle, but in execution. Pullman had been too rigid. The coal operators had been too crude. Ford's system was more thorough, more considered, backed by greater capital, and guided by a philosophy that Ford regarded as self-evidently correct. This was the man who had doubled the industrial wage and called it liberation, the man who had put the automobile within reach of the ordinary American worker and in doing so reshaped the physical landscape of a continent. This was also the man who published the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper that devoted 91 consecutive issues to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and who in 1938 accepted the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from the government of the Third Reich, the highest decoration the Nazi regime could bestow upon a foreign citizen. Ford's contradictions were not incidental to his character. They were structural, woven into the same certainty that produced both the $5 day and the Sociological department, both the Model T and the Dearborn Independent. Fordlandia was the place where those contradictions converged in a single project, where the genius and the tyranny of the same man were applied simultaneously to the same piece of ground and were answered by the indifference of the natural world and the refusal of the people who lived on it. The possibility that the principle itself was the problem, that no quantity of capital or will entitled one man to redesign the lives of others, did not occur to Ford with sufficient force to alter his behavior, or if it did, he set it aside as the kind of hesitation that built nothing and improved no one. Fordlandia occupies a particular position in this history because it represents the farthest geographical and ideological reach of the company town impulse. Pullman built his settlement 10 miles from Chicago. The coal operators built theirs in the hollows of their own country. Ford built his 4,000 miles from home in a climate he had never experienced, among people whose language he did not speak, on land whose ecology he had not studied, and governed it by memorandum from a desk in Dearborn. The ambition was civilizational. Ford intended to transplant not only a method of rubber production, but an entire way of living, to export Protestant temperance and Midwestern architecture and regimented labor and Saturday night fiddle music to the Amazon basin, and to believe, against the accumulating evidence of 2 decades, that the transplant would take. It did not. There is a temptation, when telling the story of Fordlandia, to frame it as comedy, as the tale of a rich man's folly, a tycoon building square dance pavilions in the jungle while a fungus quietly ate his trees. The temptation should be resisted. The project was not amusing to the workers who were required to eat food that made them ill, or to the families whose land was cleared without meaningful consultation, or to the communities along the Tapajós whose customs were overridden by the regulations of a foreign company operating under a concession granted by a government that had not asked their opinion. Fordlandia was an exercise of power, conducted at great distance, with great confidence, and with consequences that fell most heavily on the people who had the least voice in its design. The failure of the enterprise did not redeem it. Failure is not justice, it merely halts the accumulation of harm. What endures, beyond the rusting tower and the painted houses and the cracked sidewalks, is the parable. Fordlandia is the story of what happens when a man who has mastered a single system, the factory, the assembly line, the production of identical objects in disciplined sequence, concludes that his mastery is transferable to any domain, that the resistance of the natural world and the autonomy of foreign cultures are merely problems of management awaiting the correct application of money and method. It is the story of what happens when efficiency, elevated from technique to creed, encounters a world that does not organize itself along industrial lines and sees no reason to begin. The Amazon answered Ford's creed with leaf blight and revolt, and the slow, patient recovery of every acre he had cleared. The answer was not dramatic. It was botanical, entomological, climatological, and human, delivered across 2 decades in a language Ford never learned to read. The water tower stands, the jungle grows, the parable endures. Henry Ford believed in systems. He believed that the correct arrangement of materials, labor, and will could produce any desired result, and for most of his career the evidence supported his belief. The assembly line at Highland Park transformed the automobile from a luxury object into a commodity available to the workers who built it. The River Rouge complex in Dearborn demonstrated that a single organization could govern every stage of production from raw ore to finished vehicle. The $5 day proved that high wages could coexist with high profits, and the demonstration reshaped American industrial relations for a generation. Ford's systems worked because they operated within a world. Ford understood a world of metals, machines, and temperate latitudes, where the variables could be measured, the inputs could be controlled, and the outcomes could be calculated with reasonable confidence. The factory was Ford's domain, and within its walls his authority was close to absolute. Fordlandia was the place where that authority dissolved. The Amazon basin was not a factory floor. Its variables were not mechanical. Its resistance was not the resistance of steel or competition or labor organizing, forces Ford had encountered before and learned to overcome or suppress. Its resistance was biological, ecological, climatological, and human. The resistance of a system so complex and so deeply established that it absorbed Ford's $20 million and his 2 decades of effort and continued functioning as if neither had occurred. The leaf blight did not oppose Ford out of malice or strategy. It continued doing what it had always done, and what it had always done happened to be fatal to the arrangement Ford imposed. The workers did not reject Ford's vision because they possessed a competing ideology of industrial organization. They rejected it because they wished to eat rice and beans instead of oatmeal, to drink kashaka in the evening, to rest in the heat of the afternoon, as their parents and grandparents had done. And they did not accept that a man in Michigan, whom they had never met and who had never visited the place where they lived, possessed the authority to forbid these things. The story of Fordlandia is sometimes classified as a cautionary tale about the limits of ambition, but the framing is too generous. Ambition implies a goal worthy of pursuit. Fordlandia's goal, the imposition of one culture's habits and values on another under the authority of a private land concession, was not worthy. It was colonial in its structure, its assumptions, and its consequences, differing from the formal colonialism of the British and French empires only in the fact that it was conducted by a corporation rather than a government, and that it failed too quickly to produce lasting administrative machinery. Ford did not seek the consent of the people whose lives his project reorganized. He did not study the ecology his plantation disrupted. He did not consult the accumulated knowledge of the communities who had lived along the Tapajós for centuries, and who understood, without articulating it in the vocabulary of agronomy or management, that the forest was not a factory and could not be made into one. Ford's failure was not a failure of logistics or of insufficient investment. It was a failure of imagination. The inability to conceive that a system perfected in Michigan might not apply in the Amazon. That efficiency was a local achievement rather than a universal law, and that the world beyond the factory gate was under no obligation to cooperate with the man who built it. The ruins along the Tapajós endure because ruins are patient. The water tower, the clapboard houses, the fire hydrants, the cracked sidewalks are the physical residue of a conviction that outlasted the man who held it and the company that funded it. Ford died in 1947. The Ford Motor Company became one of the largest corporations on Earth, building vehicles on 6 continents, generating revenues that would have astonished even Ford himself. The company does not feature Fordlandia in its official histories. The $20 million is a footnote, a rounding error in the accounts of a century of production. But the story persists because the story is not finally about rubber, and it is not finally about Ford. It is about the encounter between a certain kind of certainty and a world that does not share it. An encounter that has occurred before on this continent, in Pullman and in the coal hollows of Appalachia, and on the high plains where the sod was broken for wheat that the land could not sustain, and that will occur again wherever the conviction persists that capital and will are sufficient to override the particular knowledge of a place and its people. The Tapajós flows past the settlement, as it has for millennia, brown and wide, and indifferent to the structures on its bank. Children swim in water that once reflected the hull of a gunboat sent to suppress a revolt over cafeteria food. Fishermen cast nets in the shallows where Ford's cargo ships once docked. The rubber trees that were supposed to liberate American industry from the British Empire grow wild in the surrounding forest, scattered among the mahogany and the Brazil nut trees and the strangler figs at densities of roughly 7 per acre, precisely as they have always grown, precisely as they were growing before Henry Ford decided they should be arranged in rows. The trees do not grow in rows. They never did. This has been Empire of Acres. The histories told here concern the places where American power was built, wielded, and, in time, answered by the land itself. Further accounts in this series examine other such places and the dynasties that shaped them. They are available on this channel for those who wish to continue.